It's the end of April 2018, and I'm part of a group of Minerva students finishing up our spring semester in Hyderabad in southern India. We've been here for 4 months now, getting to know the city, which I've come to know as a culturally diverse yet cohesive mixture of old and new. There's the bustling old city surrounding Charminar, which is home to a Hindu temple and a Muslim mosque only a few hundred meters apart. Then there's high-tech city, where we live, where you'll find high-rise buildings and streets full of Uber motorcycles. So we've been experiencing Hyderabad's present. But I wondered, how much do we actually know about its past? I went to my classmates to find out.
Hi, can I ask you guys a question for my history podcast?
No.
Please?
Yeah.
Okay, so can you tell me about the history of Hyderabad?
Go for it. It was ruled by various different groups, and they sometimes had conflicts, but sometimes they had peace.
Some knew a lot, some didn't know much at all, but nobody told me about the story I was about to uncover. This clip comes from a Hyderabadi woman explaining her experience in the events that shook Hyderabad in 1948 that will be the subject of this podcast.
My name is Asha B.A. and I am 95 years old. At the time of the police action, I was in Halkara.
This woman, whose interview I pulled from a BBC radio documentary, goes on to describe her months spent in hiding as Hindu mobs and the Indian army were attacking her village.
The killers were all local Hindus. They were going around killing people with swords and daggers and other sharp-edged weapons. Earlier they used to live together with us, but later they turned against us.
I was shocked. I grew to learn that this atrocity had happened in the aftermath of what was called Operation Polo, when the Indian army intervened in 1948 to force the Nizam of Hyderabad to secede to the state of India. But for such a large-scale massacre, it was surprising to me that I found so many dead ends. There were virtually no scholarly articles on the topic, and the majority of internet searches were emotively charged, clearly biased and potentially inaccurate blog posts. How had this happened? It wasn't long before I found out that this massacre was covered up. In this podcast, we delve into the horrific hidden past of Hyderabad state. We hear from people who experienced the massacre firsthand and examine the very documents that were involved in the cover-up. We question how and why this could have happened, looking at conflicting motivations of the Prime Minister at the time. But most importantly, we investigate the value of truth over just keeping the peace, and explore whether one necessarily exists without the other. That's all to come, but our story starts here.
The cameras also had news from India. Agreement has now been reached between the two dominions. But apart from Kashmir, Nehru's government has still another problem to settle. The Nizam of Hyderabad, ruler of India's biggest state, has refused to accede to the Indian Dominion, and the whole subject has been postponed for a year.
This clip from a British newsreel shows the surface of what was happening, at least from an outside perspective. Post-independence, the Nizam wanted Hyderabad to continue existing as a princely state and not secede to the rest of India. This was a tall order, given that Hyderabad is a small Muslim state in the middle of a predominantly Hindu country. There was even talk of Hyderabad joining Pakistan. But for the Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was desperately trying to keep the peace in the chaos of post-independence, this was a problem. How could he be at war with a state that already existed in his own country? Meanwhile, in Hyderabad, there were growing disturbances stemming from the military wing of the Muslim elite, the Razakars, who had begun to terrorize Hindu towns. In his memoirs from the event, Muhammad Haidar, the Muslim collector of Islamabad, wrote, "Even at its best, the Razakar was a ramshackle outfit, largely ineffective as a help to the government's law and order forces, but a propaganda gift to the Congress Party and many other critics of the Hyderabad regime. The Razakars gradually came to be seen as the private army of the Majils and the mouthpiece of the militant Islamic elements of the state." Here he claims that the actions of the Razakar forces were essentially scapegoated by the government as an excuse to invade and take over Hyderabad. This does explain why the Indian army invaded, but his religious bias should be taken into account. The reports of the Razakar action against Hindus should not be overlooked. They include cold murder, rape, theft, and much more. As we piece together this overall atrocity against Hyderabad's Muslim population, we must continue to remember the plight of both sides. After being terrorized by the Razakars, many Hindu citizens fled in fear to neighboring provinces, but upon hearing of the Indian army invasion in Hyderabad, however, they returned. But this time, they returned armed. For lack of better word, it was a massacre of revenge. What happened next was chaos, and in the hunt to identify rare sources, I found a note written by the Prime Minister after hearing of the troubles in Hyderabad, here read by a voice actor for the BBC.
I have recently had talks with Qazi Abdul Ghafur and Ms. Pachma Naidu, who have just returned from Hyderabad. They are both reliable observers. The impression I have gathered from these talks is that whilst our army is generally believed to have functioned well and to have protected the people, there is little doubt that a very large number of outbreaks took place in the small towns and villages, resulting in the massacre of possibly some thousands of Muslims by Hindus, as well as a great deal of looting, etc. This information is contrary to what I believed, and I should like it to be verified through our military and civil authorities in Hyderabad. We must know the truth, or else we shall be caught saying things which are proved to be false later.
We must know the truth, unless we should be caught to be saying things which are proved to be false later. This note reveals the Prime Minister's intentions loud and clear. He wanted to know exactly what happened, not to appease the victims or resolve the matter fairly, but to be able to protect his own reputation. Prime Minister Nehru then commissioned the Sunderlal Committee, a collection of journalists and investigators, to visit Hyderabad and report on the matter. The report speaks in plain terms about the atrocities, delivering the truth that Nehru feared, but that he feared the public learning of even more. Here's what it said. We can say at a very conservative estimate that in the whole state at least 27,000 to 40,000 people lost their lives during and after the police action. Almost everywhere in the affected areas, criminal frenzy did not exhaust itself in murder, alone in which some places even women and children were not spared. Rape, abduction of women, loot, arson, desecration of mosques, forcible conversions, seizure of houses and lands followed or accompanied the killing. Duty also compels us to add that we had absolutely unimpeachable evidence to the effect that there were instances in which men belonging to the Indian Army and also to the local police took part in looting and even further crimes. During our tour, we gathered at not a few places that soldiers encouraged, persuaded, and even compelled the Hindu mob to loot Muslim shops and houses. At one district town, the present Hindu head of the administration told us that there was a general loot of Muslim shops by the military. In another district, a Muslim house, among others, was looted by soldiers and their wives molested. Complaints of molestation and abduction of girls, against Sikh soldiers particularly, were by no means rare. We were generally told that at many places, out of the looted property, cash, gold and silver was taken away by the military while other articles fell to the share of the mob. Unfortunately, there was a certain element in the army which was not free from communal feelings, probably because some of them could not forget the atrocities committed elsewhere on their kith and kin. This report is so significant because it directly links the Indian Army, and in that case, the government, with a cold-blooded massacre. It suggests that the Sikh soldiers murdered and terrorized Muslim villagers in retaliation to the terror they had experienced at the hand of Muslims in the north, where they were invading from. Nehru could not afford such publicity, and the Sunderlal Report remained unpublished. Eventually, the Nizam gave in to the Indian Army. Afterwards, the Sunderlal Report silently disappeared into the archives, only to be released into the public a few years ago after an academic petition to bring it into the public domain. Without even as much as a monument in the city to remember this massacre, the stories of it lived on only through word of mouth. But why did he cover it up, and what does this mean for India's present? One perspective is that the Prime Minister was under such incredible amounts of pressure to secure a stable transition to Indian independence that this kind of cover-up was necessary. Historian William Dalrymple takes a sympathetic view to Nehru's decision.
This is the birth pangs of the new state, everything that this generation had fought for 30, 40 years for. And compared to the bloodshed in the north, this was a small price to pay.
Given the turbulence of India at the time, you could argue that this was a reasonable temporary measure to maintain stability, but why has it been covered up until today? School children are still not taught about this event in schools, and there are still no museum exhibits to commemorate this tragic episode in Hyderabad's history. The government has still not apologised to the families of those affected. This is larger than birth pangs. This was at least 30,000 lives. In the grander scale of India's loss during these years, it may seem small, but if you consider the individual communities it affected, the culture lost, the stories forever to remain untold, it deserves greater attention. I reached out to a Muslim friend of mine to investigate whether she had heard of it. It turns out she had, but only by accident. This is what she told me.
Hi, I am Juvelia Javed. I live in Hyderabad. I have lived here for all of the 23 years of my life. And I had just finished my medical. When I first found out about this massacre, it was not through a conventional history textbook, or it was not taught to me at my school or by my teacher. A few years ago, my father, who owns his own school,
She tells me she found out about the massacre by uncovering some documents she found in her father's project. I asked her how this made her feel.
It's really sad, and it feels demeaning to not even have your pain acknowledged. You know what I mean? Like, you're not even acknowledging that there was something, that there was this scar that is there in all of our families, and honestly, like, nobody from that era is alive as of now. I mean, you hear this stuff from your grandparents, and they don't usually talk about that stuff anymore. But at least the fact that no government has come out and actually apologized for what happened is something that is really disturbing and demeaning, is what I feel.
She told me that by covering this up, the government had created an insecurity that runs through generations.
Because how would you feel if someone killed your families and then erased them as if they had never existed?
She has a point, and a point that could explain some of the mistrust in Indian governments today. Why would you trust a government that didn't acknowledge a historical truth you knew existed? Hyderabad's transition into India was not bloodless, like the hegemonic narrative led us to believe. Indian independence led to a loss of independence for Hyderabad state, which in turn led to a momentous loss of lives on both sides. Only with an understanding of this forgotten piece of history can we fully understand the way Hyderabad is today. Moreover, it has shaped how we understand history and treat our minorities. From making up a quarter of Hyderabad's population as a whole and most of the ruling elite in the 1940s, the Muslim population of Hyderabad began to deplete even more after the massacres. The richer Muslims fled, leaving behind a much smaller, poorer community of Muslims who today are Hyderabad's minority. Finally, Javeria stressed to me that peace is always an option. Don't underestimate the power of acceptance amongst Hyderabadis. After all, they have lived together harmoniously for the best part of 70 years. Perhaps it is time for the Indian government to step up and face the truth to the public. After all, Javeria said that Hyderabadis can take it. In fact, they'd welcome it.
Just tolerance, there is acceptance in Hyderabad. I would like to point out that regardless of what happened in the past, acceptance is what Hyderabadis are, good at. So I think our governments underestimate our ability of accepting to what happened.